Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this game, I got a little rapid 10-minute action going. Got a really nice game in the advanced Caro Kann. The Caro Kann is such a difficult weapon to face when black plays it against you. And as my last video, Beat the Caro Kann by playing e5, was one of my more popular videos, I thought we'd do a little follow-up here and take some of the analysis a little bit deeper. So going up against the Caro, as you know, I definitely recommend e5 here. There is a fantasy variation where we can do some other things. I really like the e5 because in the e5 we end up with this structure against the French defense a lot, and everything's going to cross over really nicely, so we don't have to study too much at one time. So in this game, my opponent plays correctly and plays the immediate c5. Just starts to transition into more of a French structure, but he's a move behind and slightly delayed. So computer really likes it if you play d takes c5 here. I opt in this game to just stick with my normal structure and just go c3, getting the same structure that I usually end up with in the French, and it's extremely solid. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And in this game, my opponent plays knight to c6, and I play knight to f3. Just going with my traditional structure. And what makes this game really interesting is and differentiates the Caro from a French is that in this game my opponent decides to play bishop to g4. Now, as you know, in the Caro Kann, a lot of times what will happen is rather than playing knight to c6, black will bring the bishop out to f5 and then seal it outside the pawn chain by playing e6, and sometimes then plays c5. So my opponent, if I were to go look in his database, we'd probably see that he's played a lot of different games in the French. And once he saw me come with this advanced structure, decided to go into more of a French defense. And then when I came out, he played a move that you're not usually going to see in the Caro Kann, which is bishop to g4. And so this video is going to be about how to handle this pin and some of the best ways to do that. Now, normally in the Caro, the bishop's on f5, so as soon as you play knight to f3, your opponent is usually not going to just move the bishop twice. He is sealing the bishop outside of the pawn chain by playing e6. And so you're not going to have an opportunity for this structure, but this kind of structure can be applicable across the board. And in this position, what I did is I decided to go ahead and counter my opponent's move with bishop to b5, which sort of just leads to an equal game. Okay, we're each pinning each other's bishops, one to a queen, one to a king, and what the computer tells me to go ahead and do here is just go ahead and take the pawn on c5. And I want to play this out for you guys because I really want you to understand how powerful it can be to just go ahead and take this pawn when your opponent has not yet played e6, and what this structure is going to look like as it plays out. So after d takes c5, a lot of times what you'll get is you're going to get e6. And this is opening up the bishop's attack on the e6 pawn. And so what the computer recommends in this situation, by far the best move, bishop to e3. So now we're defending that pawn and we're simply up a pawn right now. Now this is potentially short-lived because after bishop takes, queen takes, you can say, well, why can't black just go ahead and take our pawn back? Now everything's equal, and he's taking our pawn with tempo on our queen. This is not a great move for black, and the way that you punish this is to just now go ahead and just play bishop to b5 check. Anything other than knight c6 is just losing. So knight comes back to c6, and now we have the tempo. Black has just lost tempo with that pawn take. And we can quite simply just castle in this position. And now, from here, there's a few things to understand. Number one, even before we castle, it's important to know that we can castle because white is already much better here. One of the reasons is if you just count development, black has 3 pieces developed, and we have 5 pieces developed. We are also only 1 move away from castling, whereas black is going to have to move several pieces in order to be able to castle. So this is a nice, steady advantage for white. There's not much for us to press here. If you're ever at a position in an opening where you're trying to decide, you know that you're ahead in development, The material in this case is equal, but the development is 5 pieces to 3 pieces in your favor. There's not much to be gained by continuing to develop pieces, like for example, by playing knight to d2. That's not really going to achieve very much, especially because we don't know where we want this knight to go. We might want to castle and put our rook on d1, and at that point the knight is just going to be in our way. So in a position like this, if you're trying to consider whether or not to maybe take, or castle, or play a different type of move, or maybe slide the queen over to put pressure on the g7 pawn so that the bishop can't develop immediately, it's totally okay if you're up 5 pieces to 3 in development to just go ahead and castle. Now, one really important thing that I want to show you guys is, and I want you to go ahead and pause the video here and figure out what you would do if black plays a6 in this situation. Should you just go ahead and take with the bishop, or should you not take with the bishop? So go ahead and pause the video here and figure out what you want to do. So I really like the idea here of just bishop to a5. Computer says you can do either. You can play bishop to a5, or you can just take the knight. One of the reasons being is that this pawn on c5 prevents black from being able to play b5, driving our bishop back, which is so common, you've seen this a million times, because of en passant. And that way we're going to retain the bishop pair and maintain that advantage throughout the game as well. The bishop can eventually come back to c2, where it's going to exert pressure over along this file. So at some point, if white decides to castle, we can bring the queen over to h3, all sorts of things. So the bishop, very, very useful there. Now, what I also want you to be prepared for is after we castle, a move like bishop to e7. Bishop to e7 takes a little bit of a page out of Alekhine's defense, which I do have some videos on. It takes a bit of a page out where the plan now is black is getting his bishop off of f8 before white's queen can move over to g3, putting pressure on the g7 pawn. If white were to play g3 now black has to move bishop to f6. This is extremely important. And once it's on f6, where this bishop is going to head, whether or not we play queen g3 next or not, bishop to f6, most likely coming soon for black, where it'll exert pressure on our b2 pawn, x-raying through the c3 pawn. What we want to be ready to play in a move like this, and it's really tricky to just kind of see this on your own, is we want to be ready to play a move like c4. c4 very tricky because it threatens to take, and then if queen takes, black takes, and black ends up with an isolated pawn here. So that's not great for black. What also is impossible for black in a situation like this is if black decides to play a move like d4, for example, which is probably what you're thinking. I want you to pause the video now and try to figure out what would you play here if black decided to play d4. d4 is a massive blunder, and it basically loses the game for black on the spot. Okay, so you've had a chance. There are 2 really acceptable moves here right now. One is just quite simply bishop takes c6. You can tell that after bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, queen takes c6, the king is going to have to run. He's going to lose his castle. He's going to be tucked away on f8, and nothing is going to be great there. Now, we can play bishop takes d4 here, and the reason that black can't take with the queen is because now after takes and king to f8, you definitely don't want to take. Well, I'll show you what happens if you take. You take, and then the king has to go to f8, and then you check. and this is basically game over. Black has to block the check either with the bishop or the queen. So the queen cannot take this bishop. The knight can obviously not take this bishop because it's pinned to the king by the rook, by the bishop. So I just wanted to show you guys this opening sequence, which really all kind of goes back to realizing that in a position like this, that the e7 pawn still stands, blocking the dark squared bishop from being able to come out and take here, that we do have d takes c5 in such a position, and even after that we can follow up with bishop to e3, hanging on to the pawn, and even after bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop to b5 check, causes the knight to come back to c6, and this is a relatively massive advantage for white, where he can simply castle and move through here. So really just wanted to get you guys familiar with this position here, where we can and should very often just go ahead and take this pawn, fight to keep it by playing this bishop to e3 move and hanging on there. And then later on, now with that pawn, even if the knight doesn't end up taking on e5, and this bishop doesn't end up taking here, and this queen doesn't end up taking here, with our bishop on b5, this a6, b5 push, driving our bishop back, is no longer available because of the c5 pawn blocking en passant. So I just wanted you guys to be aware of this. Another little tool in your toolbox for fighting against the Caro Kann, and doing it in the advanced formation where we do have our pawn on e5. So hope you found this useful. You start identifying some times in your games where you can use these little tricks, knowing when to take on c5. And we'll catch you on the next one. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe. We're just going to keep hitting you with awesome content.